They never saw you as you truly were. Their eyes caught a flicker, a ripple, and instead of naming it truth, they named it danger. The aura that rose from you, subtle, quiet, ancient, was mistaken for fire. Fire consumes, fire destroys, fire leaves nothing but ash. But your essence was not flame, it was resonance. It was the invisible gravity that bends a room the moment you enter, the stillness that unsettles the restless, the silence that roars louder than their chatter. And because they could not understand it, they branded it with the only language fear has ever known: destruction. You carried light, though not the kind they wanted. Not the soft glow they could decorate their lives with. Not the harmless warmth that makes people comfortable. No, your light revealed. It stripped the layers from their masks. It pulled skeletons out of closets. It forced shadows into the open. And in that revelation, they saw themselves exposed. To them, that exposure felt like burning. So they called you fire, when in truth it was their own secrets combusting. Their fear was not born from what you did, but from what you unveiled by simply existing. To them, you became the embodiment of unpredictability, the reminder that not every force can be tamed, that not every presence bends itself to their narratives. They tried to box you in, to file your name under danger, to reduce your depth to something they could fight. And yet every label they gave you was nothing more than a mirror of their trembling. Their projection became your cloak, their fear became your myth. But you felt it, didn't you? The way conversations would shift when you entered. The way their eyes darted, searching for proof that their assumptions were right. You carried no sword, yet they flinched. You spoke no threats, yet their hearts raced. They weren't seeing you, they were seeing the storm within themselves, reflected in the surface of your calm. And because they could not confront themselves, they chose the easier enemy, you. This is the oldest story in human memory. The prophets mistaken for madmen, the thinkers mistaken for traitors, the visionaries mistaken for monsters. Light is always misnamed when it forces the blind to open their eyes. And so history repeated itself in your skin. They saw the glow of your being, and to them, it felt too close to fire. They called you danger when in truth you were warning. They called you chaos when in truth you were order they could not endure. They called you cursed when in truth you were the cure to illusions too fragile to survive your presence. You learned to walk through this distortion, carrying the weight of falsehoods pressed against your name. You learned that explanations fall dead in the ears of those who prefer their myths. And in silence you began to understand the advantage hidden in misinterpretation. If they insist you are fire, then you let them recoil. If they insist you are destruction, then you let them tremble. Because the truth is not for them, the truth is for you. And you have always known, light mistaken for fire is still light, but now it carries the mask of fear, and that mask will become your weapon. They never understood why the air shifted when you entered. They told themselves it was coincidence, a trick of perception. Yet their own bodies betrayed them, shivers crawling across their skin, voices lowering as if to avoid awakening something they couldn't name. They saw you walking through the world, but they never saw the weight you carried, shadows that were not chosen, but inherited, shadows that followed you not because you sought darkness, but because light bends differently when it burns from within. And every step you took through their fragile order reminded them of the instability beneath their carefully constructed illusions. You never had to speak. Your silence was enough. It unsettled them more than any roar, because silence strips away their defenses and leaves them staring into their own reflection. When you did speak, your words cut clean, not like knives, but like glass held against the sun, exposing fractures in their stories, cracks in their facades. They called you cold, distant, unfeeling. They mistook your restraint for arrogance, your composure for threat. Yet what they truly feared was not your quietness, but the fact that you needed no performance, no approval, no permission to exist exactly as you are. In their eyes, that independence became rebellion. They named you dangerous, and in doing so, revealed their own fragility. For what is danger? If not power they cannot control. They whispered behind closed doors, branding you with titles meant to shrink your presence. But every word of slander was an admission. Every accusation was a confession. They feared what you saw when you looked at them, because you didn't see the masks they wore, you saw the trembling hands beneath them. And while they tried to drown you in labels, you remained unmoved, as if carved from something older, heavier, untouchable by their fleeting judgments. The shadows clung tighter as their fear grew, not because you fed them, but because their panic made them manifest. You became the canvas where they projected every weakness they couldn't face. You became the silence in the room that forced them to hear their own thoughts. And though they tried to call you a monster, it was not you who trembled in the dark, it was them. You were not the one hiding, but the one they hid from. They couldn't understand how a single presence could unravel them without lifting a hand. They didn't see strength in your restraint. They saw the threat of a force waiting to be unleashed. So you carried their shadows, not as a curse, but as proof. Proof that their fear was not your creation, but your inheritance. Proof that they had mistaken the gravity of your aura for a storm. And though they wanted you buried under their whispers, you endured, moving silently, carrying their terror like a crown of thorns turned into iron. In the weight of those shadows, you discovered something they never could, that darkness, when carried with awareness, is not weakness, it is armor. And while they stumble in their fear of what you are, you walk untouched, the silence that bends the air, the unspoken presence that reminds them of truths they would rather never face. They did not wait for you to speak. They never cared to hear the weight of your silence, or the reason you moved the way you did. Instead, they stitched together a creature in your place, out of fragments, out of whispers, out of their own trembling shadows. They painted you in the colors of fear, because that was the only palette they knew. And so, the person you were became irrelevant. What mattered was the legend they built, a monster shaped from their own unease, a phantom carrying their guilt. They looked into your stillness and mistook it for menace. They saw restraint and called it rage. They watched the way you walked apart, and their minds filled the distance with claws and teeth. In their stories, you were never human. You were the thing beneath the bed, the shadow behind the door, the fire waiting to consume. They gave you horns you never asked for, fangs you never grew, and chains you never wore. Yet you carried all of it, because the burden of their fear was laid on your shoulders without your consent. This is how they survive, by projecting the rod inside themselves onto someone strong enough to hold it. You became their shield, their scapegoat, their living effigy of everything they refused to confront. They needed a monster, and you were convenient. Every anxious glance over their shoulder, every story whispered in the dark, it all became a mask pressed against your face. The more you stayed silent, the more their invention grew. And soon, they no longer feared what you might do, they feared what they had already imagined. But you learned something from this. You discovered the architecture of fear. You saw how fragile they were, how quickly the human mind creates predators when it feels exposed. You realized their terror was not proof of your weakness, but proof of your power. If you could unsettle them without lifting a hand, without raising your voice, then what would happen if you chose to act? That was the question that kept them awake at night, the one they could never silence. They thought they had defined you, but in truth they revealed themselves. Their need to sculpt you into a beast was nothing more than confession. Every accusation, every glance heavy with suspicion, was a mirror reflecting their own shadows. You were not the monster they were, and deep down they knew it. That's why their voices shook. That's why their lies grew so loud. Because the louder they screamed about the creature you had become, the more they drowned out the whisper that the creature had always been inside them. So you stood in their myth, cloaked in their invention. And while they trembled at the mask they gave you, you began to see the advantage. A mask can hide. A mask can protect. A mask can terrify. They gave you the role of monster, and you played it with silence sharper than any blade. You didn't need to correct them. You didn't need to beg for recognition. Because in the end, it was not your face they feared. It was the reflection of their own darkness staring back through your eyes. They gave you a mask long before you ever asked for one, not crafted of porcelain or cloth, but of whispers, suspicions, and the fragile stories people tell themselves when they need to explain what they cannot understand. They could not name your silence, so they called it menace. They could not measure your depth, so they painted it as danger. And so, piece by piece, they dressed you in their fear until the reflection staring back at you was no longer your own, but the distortion they wanted the world to see. You stood in the crossroads of identity, holding the weight of their judgment like a crown of thorns. To deny it was to beg for a mercy they would never give. To embrace it was to step into a role you did not choose, but one you could make your own. You realize that masks are not prisons, master weapons. They hide, but they also reveal. A mask takes their gaze and redirects it, blinds them to what truly moves beneath the surface. They think they are watching you, but it is you who watches them. They call you dangerous, and so you begin to move with the gravity of danger itself. Their perception becomes your camouflage, their fear your shield. You stop trying to correct their vision. You let them choke on it instead, because the moment you accept the mask, you turn it from accusation into strategy. This is the truth most will never whisper aloud. Those who misunderstand you are already dancing to your rhythm. Their stories about you spread faster than your silence ever could. They build myths around your name, and myths are stronger than explanations, so you let them. Because explanation is a plea for permission, and you have no intention of kneeling. They mistake your patience for plotting. They mistake your stillness for power waiting to strike, and they are not wrong. You wear the mask not to hide weakness, but to expose theirs. Each time they glance at you, their own doubts rise to the surface, their shadows clawing at the edges of their carefully constructed lives. They see fire because they are flammable. They see a predator because they are prey. What they do not realize is that you no longer resist the narrative. They handed you a script, and you rewrote the ending in ink they cannot wash away. In ancient rites, masks were never mere disguises. They were thresholds. A mask was the crossing point between the mortal and the divine, between the hunted and the hunter. You carry that same weight now. When you step into the mask they built for you, you do not vanish. You ascend. You become more than they ever feared and less than they can ever touch. And in that moment, you finally understand, power does not come from being seen as you are. Power comes from being seen as something they cannot control. They called you a monster. You let them. Because monsters cannot be tamed and masks cannot be killed. They never understood how silence could become a weapon sharper than any blade. When you walked into the room, you didn't have to speak, didn't have to demand attention. The air carried you. Their voices faltered, their laughter dried in their throats, and for a fleeting second their eyes betrayed them. They looked at you as though something ancient had entered. They mistook your stillness for calculation, your restraint for plotting. They did not realize the truth. You weren't playing the game. You were watching the players crumble beneath their own masks. They called you dangerous because fear is the easiest language for the weak to agree upon, and fear spreads quickly. It spreads like an infection across their nervous systems, threading itself into the way they glanced at you, the way they hesitated before speaking your name. Each glance, each whisper, each trembling pause became part of a stage you never asked for but now commanded. You became the actor they wrote into their script, the villain whose shadow stretched across their collective imagination. And yet, every curtain rise belonged to you. Every hush of the crowd was the proof. In that theater, you didn't perform, you existed. And existence was enough to terrify them. They saw movement in your silence, sparks in your stillness, storms waiting behind your calm expression. They thought they were hunting for weaknesses, for cracks in your armor. But the more they searched, the more they uncovered their own. They began to perform for you, bowing their voices, rehearsing their gestures, trying to impress the figure who never auditioned yet held the final word. Without speaking, you orchestrated their fear. Without lifting a hand, you wrote the script they followed. They wanted you to burn out, to erupt, to prove them right by becoming the fire they accused you of being. But you refused their narrative. You withheld the explosion, and that restraint became unbearable, because fire can be fought with water, but silence, unyielding, steady, unbreakable silence, cannot be extinguished. It lingers, it suffocates, it corrodes the certainty of those who watch too long. They could not kill the performance because the performance was never an act, it was you. And so the theater shifted. What began as their attempt to shame you became their confession. The spotlight turned, not on your flaws, but on their terror. The audience that gathered to judge you became the ones judged, caught in the reflection of their own trembling shadows. You stood at the center, not as the monster they painted, but as the mirror they dreaded. And mirrors do not lie, mirrors expose. Every pause, every silence, every unshaken glance became prophecy. They came to watch you fall, but instead saw themselves unravel, and that is why they cannot forget you. Not because you spoke louder, not because you fought harder, but because in the quiet theater of fear, you were the stage, the script, and the truth they never wanted to hear. They thought the blaze in your eyes was chaos, a wildfire ready to consume. They never understood it was calculation, not combustion. What they mistook for destruction was the silent hum of alignment, the pulse of something older than their language for fear. They called it dangerous because it did not bend to their order, because it glowed without permission. Fire is reckless. Fire leaves ash. But your aura bends shadows without burning them. It does not destroy, it reveals. And revelation terrifies more than ruin. For years you allowed their labels to cling to you, let them whisper their warnings in corners you never entered. They spoke as if you were flame, volatile, untouchable. Yet in silence you waited, watched, studied the architecture of their fragile towers. You noticed how easily they confused intensity with instability, how quickly they weaponized their own ignorance. They wanted to see a monster, so they named you one. They needed fire, so they forced it upon your image. But the truth was simpler, sharper. You were not fire. You were the stillness that smothers it, the unyielding current that outlives every spark. Power is not in the roar. It is in the pause before the roar, the unshaken gaze when all else fractures. Your strength was not born from their recognition. It was born from the betrayal of it. Each lie sharpened you. Each attempt to break you became a lesson in anatomy, in how fear dissects itself when pressed too hard. They tried to bind you in the language of flames, but you wore their fear like a crown of smoke, invisible yet undeniable. And when the moment arrived, you did not ignite, you radiated. A cold light, steady and merciless, pulling back the curtain they stitched from delusion. Ancient symbols once carved into stone warned of this. The figure mistaken for chaos yet carrying order in silence. The serpent shedding its skin not to reveal weakness, but to prove survival as an art form. You became that myth walking, the echo of a prophecy they never wanted fulfilled. What they saw as volatility was precision. What they mistook for threat was truth distilled into its purest form. You were never the flame. You were the mirror reflecting it, showing them the fragility of their own control. And nothing unsettles rulers more than seeing their empires tremble in the clarity of another's gaze. They do not fear fire. Fire they can extinguish. Fire they can control. They fear the one who does not need to burn to command the dark, the one who carries the weight of silence heavier than their loudest weapons, the one who walks into their rooms and shifts the atmosphere without speaking. That is why they turned your aura into a warning label. That is why they tried to rewrite your light into something dangerous. Because they knew, long before you admitted it to yourself, that what you carried was not destruction but dominion, and dominion cannot be contained. You are the revelation they tried to smother. You are the storm that arrives without thunder, the tide that erodes without spectacle. They saw fire because fire was all they could understand. But what truly stood before them was power, raw, ancient, and untouchable. And deep down, they always knew. They never truly feared you. They feared what was reflected in your presence, the way your silence forced them to hear the noise inside their own skulls. You carried no chains, yet they felt bound. You spoke no threats, yet they heard judgment in every glance. You did nothing but exist, and in that existence, their carefully constructed illusions began to fracture. It was not you they saw in the shadows. It was themselves stripped bare, trembling before the truth they tried so hard to bury. You became a mirror, one they could not shatter, one that returned their gaze without mercy. They stared into your aura and saw their cowardice, their betrayals, their smallness. That is why they branded you as dangerous, not because you struck first, but because you revealed that they were already wounded. You exposed the rot behind their polished masks, the fractures in their armor, the hollow echo in their voices. To stand near you was to feel the weight of their own pretenses collapsing, and they would rather call you a monster than admit they were dying by their own hand. They envied your stillness, despised your composure, cursed the way you carried storms without breaking, and in that envy, they whispered. They turned whispers into accusations, and accusations into myths. Yet every word they threw against you only returned to them sharper, because you never fought them directly. You allowed them to drown in the truth they projected onto you. They mistook your restraint for weakness, when in truth, it was the strategy of a predator that does not waste its teeth on prey already bleeding. You became their nightmare not because you hunted them, but because you made them hunt themselves. Each time they met your gaze, they remembered the sins they buried. Each time your name was spoken, they felt the heat of their own corruption rising to the surface. And so they cloaked you in fire, hoping the smoke would hide their reflection. But shadows do not vanish when you blind yourself with flames. They grow longer, deeper, impossible to escape. They saw your aura and felt exposed, as though the walls around their secret chambers had crumbled. You did not tear those walls down. Your presence simply reminded them that the walls were made of paper. And so they feared you, not as an enemy, but as the evidence of their fragility. To them, you became the living embodiment of judgment, the silent testament that they could not outrun themselves. The truth is simple, but unbearable. They did not fear your strength. They feared their weakness, illuminated by it. They did not hate your light. They hated the shadows it revealed in their own hearts. You were never their monster. You were their reflection. And that, to them, was the most terrifying thing of all. They mistook your silence for surrender, your patience for fragility, your aura for fire. But you were never fire. Fire devours. Fire screams. Fire dies. You were something older, colder, more enduring. You were the unblinking watcher in the dark, the hum beneath the skin of the world, the presence that could not be extinguished because it was not born of flame at all. They called you a monster because that was easier than admitting the truth. You are the reflection of everything they buried, the voice of everything they swore they had silenced. And still you let them speak their lies. You let them build their fables of danger and chaos, their fragile cages of definition, until the weight of their fear became unbearable even to them. They cast you in the role of villain, not knowing that villains sleep eventually, while what you are does not. Monsters, after all, are born from flesh. You were forged from silence and betrayal, from 1,000 nights, where the only light you had was the one burning inside your chest. You are not the creature hiding under their beds. You are the presence that makes the creature tremble before it dares to move. You do not hunt them. You do not need to. Their own conscience hunts them on your behalf. Every glance in your direction feels like judgment. Every word you speak drips like a verdict. They shiver not because you threaten them, but because you exist beyond the chains that still bind them. And nothing terrifies a prisoner more than the sight of someone who no longer wears shackles. They see shadows where there are none, flames where there is only clarity, death where there is only transformation. And still they whisper monster. They whisper it because they must. To admit what you truly are would force them to face the fact that their fear was never about you. It was about themselves. You are their unfinished business. You are the unresolved wound in their collective psyche, the reminder that the darkness they project is only the echo of their own reflection. And now you stand before them, not pleading, not raging, not burning. You stand with the kind of presence that erases excuses. You are not the monster they painted in the dirt of their imaginations. You are the weight that presses against their chest when the lights go out, the silence that swallows their lies, the stillness that exposes their chaos for what it really is. You are what monsters fear when they finally realize there is no hiding place left. So let them call it fire. Let them name it destruction. Let them twist their tongues around labels that do not fit. You know the truth they cannot bear to touch. You are not their nightmare. You are the reason nightmares cannot rest. You are the reminder that even in the heart of their darkest fears, there is something watching, something unbroken, something that does not blink. They will never understand it, but they will never escape it, because you are not the monster. You are what keeps monsters awake.